I'm happy to welcome you to the April session of the Bradley Lecture Series at AEI. I want to make an announcement before introducing our lecturer this evening. The scheduled lecture for May has had to be changed. The individual who was scheduled to speak, Shelby Steele, professor at San Jose State, was obliged to cancel. We will include him in our series next year. I'm very happy that somebody who was going to speak next year is going to speak in May instead. He is Professor Anthony Appia, professor of Afro-American Studies at Harvard, whose lecture in May will be titled Fallacies of Eurocentrism and of Afrocentrism. A little bit of biographical information about Professor Appia is on the yellow flyers on your seats. Notice in particular that the lecture, having been scheduled for the 11th of May, has been changed to Monday, May 10th. Sam Peltzman is Sears Roebuck Professor of Economics and Financial Services at the University of Chicago and Director of Chicago's Center for the Study of the Economy and the State, and a member of AEI's Council of Academic Advisors. Some biographical information about Professor Peltzman is on your chairs as well. He is one of America's foremost economists, and his research and writing is characterized by a combination of qualities that would be valuable even if they were not so rare. And that is, on the one hand, a high degree of technical and theoretical sophistication, and on the other, a relentless quest for hard empirical fact, illustrating the actual operation of markets and institutions, both political and private. He has trained his great research skills over the years on issues ranging from drug regulation to patterns of voting behavior to the patterns of redistributions affected by the political process. And in the past several years has been engaged in a large and important piece of research examining the performance of America's public schools from the perspective of industrial organization. The results of a good part of that research are the subject of his lecture this evening, entitled Why the Public Schools Have Declined. Sam Peltzman.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd like to begin my talk tonight by imagining that we have taken a trip back through time. Imagine that we have come from a typical American classroom of today to a classroom of a generation ago. To some of us here of a certain age, there'll be a certain nostalgia connected with this trip. If you take this imaginary trip, and we're back in an old classroom of around 1960, we notice many things are different from the classroom that we just left. Perhaps the most obvious thing is there are many more students. If it's a typical classroom of that era, 40% more than the classroom that we have just left. We look around in vain for a teaching assistant. We look around in vain for a lot of equipment. Think of audiovisual equipment. What do we see? We see maybe the scratchy old record player in the corner, probably shared with a few other classes. Books and art materials. They're much fewer than the classroom we've come from, and they're doled out more sparingly. The place we're in has an altogether more forbidding austerity about it than the more intimate and friendly place which we have left. And austerity is the appropriate word. The classroom that we're in is getting by with about a third the real dollar expenditures of today's classroom. There is, of course, another fact about this classroom that comes as a considerable embarrassment to we, the voyagers from this generation. This classroom seems to be turning out better educated students than today's, at least in terms of basic knowledge, in terms of literacy and numeracy. Today's average high school graduate seems to be no match for his counterpart of a generation ago. While you can quibble with the details, the broad facts today are beyond any serious dispute. Average performance of students has declined, and it's declined noticeably. The most widely cited statistic, of course, the one which I would imagine many people in this room are familiar with, is the decline in SAT scores, which receives wide publicity. Now, there's some dispute about whether these the SAT scores exaggerate a little bit or understate a little bit, but they do convey the essential point. In today's crop of college freshmen, only a third are doing better than the average freshman of a generation ago. Now, in an important respect, all of this is old news. At least it can be said that over the last 10 or 15 years, things have not gotten worse, and in some respects, they've gotten better. But on the whole, as a broad generalization, America's schools today are performing roughly at the level they were in around 1980. The intriguing question with which I'm going to be concerned today is what happened in the half generation prior to 1980 to bring us to where essentially we are today. And within the limits of time, I want to discuss what is likely to happen in the years ahead. The record of this period that I'm going to be focusing on, which runs from about 1965 to 1980, is truly amazing. Real expenditures per student doubled over this period. Pupil-teacher ratios declined by a fourth. In both respects, these are historically unprecedented growth rates of inputs. And of course, student achievement deteriorated badly by every available measure. Now, for an ordinary business to double its inputs, yet somehow manage to produce less, is unthinkable. But that is what happened to American education in this roughly 15-year period leading up to 1980. Now, I wish I could tell you why this swift change occurred. Unfortunately, I cannot. This is not the place to review the attempts of social scientists to uncover the source of this deterioration. Suffice it to say that to this day, they've been largely unsuccessful. The difficulty is that the decline was so sudden, so sharp, and so pervasive. It affected every region and every socioeconomic group, for example, that it really constitutes a singular event. Virtually nothing that distinguishes the 1960s and the 1970s from other decades can really be ruled out as a cause of this decline. And on the other hand, the suddenness of the decline, you can really date it within a year or two of 1965. It's almost that precise. That suddenness rules out the operation or the important contribution of any long-run trend that was well underway by 1960. My focus here is going to be less ambitious than trying to give you a single answer to this very important question of what went wrong. Rather, I want to shed light on one aspect of the problem, but one that is often neglected. And this is the political context within which American schools operate. We really shouldn't lose sight of an important fact about American elementary and secondary education. And it's a fact that I think bears telling to an audience in the District of Columbia in particular. American education, American elementary and secondary education is overwhelmingly a public enterprise. The public sector accounts for around 9 out of every 10 students, and an even larger share of the expenditures. Indeed, if you take it as a whole, it's probably our largest public enterprise. In terms of employment, it would comfortably exceed the size of the defense establishment, which I suppose would be the candidate for runner-up. Now, because American schools are funded publicly, administered by public employees, they're inevitably going to be subject to the pulling and tugging of political forces. And I want to argue, on the basis of some of the research that I've done, that the way these political forces have evolved has contributed to some degree to the way schools have performed. I don't want to overstate this point. I'm not arguing that everything we need to know about America's schools is the result of political forces. I am arguing that they play some role and a not insignificant role. Now, this should hardly be a radical suggestion. If, for example, I came here to talk about the performance of the Defense Department rather than the public schools, and I wished to argue that the way the defense establishment operates rests entirely on the play of domestic politics, that would be an exaggeration. But if I told you that domestic politics never nurtured an obsolete weapon system past its time, you would be correctly skeptical. It is, at least to me, striking that the role of politics is almost completely ignored in the large body of social science research on student achievement. But it is a fact. It is largely ignored. And that my own research, of course, has not ignored the link between politics and the way schools perform, and I want to share with you some of the results today. What I have done in this research is I've taken advantage of the decentralized organization of American public schools. Public education is almost entirely a state and local concern in this country. We have 50 different state departments of education making policy, thousands of local school boards with some degree of autonomy. And whatever the political forces that are operating on education, and I will be more specific about what I think the important ones are in a minute, they are inevitably local politics in this sense. And that means they inevitably will differ in their weight and in their timing from place to place. I can also report that there's a substantial local variety in the way that school systems seem to perform, at least as measured by the way their students, what their students achieve. I was fortunately able in the course of doing this research to be able to piece together state-by-state data on trends for one large group of students, namely high school students who are going on to college, and therefore typically they're taking a college entrance exam, either the SAT, which I mentioned before, or the ACT. These are the two major college entrance exams which between them test roughly 2 million students a year. And I was able, with the cooperation of both the SAT and the ACT people, to piece together state-by-state trends in scores. And if you look at the pre-1980 period and you put everything in terms of SAT scores, just because that's somewhat more familiar, in the average state, SAT scores were declining by 5 points a year. That is, we have a test which the average score today in the nation is about 900. It was in the upper 900s when this decline started, and over a 15-year period was going down by about 5 points a year. No state avoided completely this decline, not a single one. But declines half as large or half again as large were not uncommon. So there's a large, there's obviously some school systems are doing a better job in avoiding these whatever these forces are than others. The advantage of all this local variety from a research perspective is that it allows one to ask what kinds of political environment seemed to be conducive to relatively more successful performance. Since there is a lot of variety, you can look at these states which are relatively more successful and ask what kind of political environment seems to characterize them. And let me illustrate the answer that I came up with one important case. The rise of teacher unionization. Now, this began, interestingly enough, just about the time that student performance nationally begins to decline. Before 1960, it seems almost a prehistory to think about it, but before 1960, there was essentially no teacher unionization. Then in the 1960s, there was very rapid growth. By the end of that decade, over half the teachers in the country were unionized, and today about 3/4 belong to one or the other of the two major national teachers' unions. This rapid early growth, which got over half of the teachers unionized in less than 10 years, was also accompanied by pressure on state legislatures to grant unions new rights. These days, it's an annual rite of fall that you have teacher strikes. It's, again, perhaps prehistoric, but not in 1960. Public employees generally didn't have the right to strike in 1960, but there was a lot of political pressure exerted on state legislatures to give public employees, including teachers, the right to strike. The important point here is that the success of all these efforts was very uneven. The initial success of the teacher unions was in New York City and New York State. That success then spread first to a few urban centers and the states which contained them, and then spread beyond those places. Even to this day, there are a few states in which teacher unionization is essentially non-existent. And one can ask then, what happened to student achievement in those places where the push for teacher organization was most successful most quickly? What happened in those states where the legislatures were most receptive to union pressures for things like the right to strike? Now, the broad answer to this question, and that's all really I have time for today, the broad answer to this question is that student achievement tended to do worse. That is, to deteriorate worse than average in those areas where the success of these union efforts was most pronounced most early. Now, let me say I do not find this terribly surprising. And it's not because I believe the teacher unions are indifferent or hostile to student achievement. In fact, perhaps the opposite is more nearly true. I should mention that the head of the pioneer teachers union, Albert Shanker of the American Federation of Teachers, has emerged as a very powerful voice for improving the academic performance of students in recent years. However, whatever the wish, unions also have other concerns. They have traditional concerns for job security, for promotion and pay differential rules, and the like. And here, as in life generally, there are trade-offs. Inevitably, there are going to be trade-offs. That is, you can't always have union-style job security and a very flexible ability to replace underperforming teachers coexisting. Let me discuss another powerful trend that was operating on the political environment of schools when their performance deteriorated. And that has the locus of political control changed. Political control became considerably more centralized. Now, this tendency actually goes back a long ways. It begins really right after World War II with a movement to consolidate local school districts. The end of World War II, at the end of World War II, we had 100,000 school districts in the United States. By 1970, when the consolidation movement was at an end, we had only 20,000, which is what we have roughly today, a little bit under 20,000. About 15 years after this movement began, again, around 1960, interestingly enough, a move toward financial centralization began. Until then, local school boards raised the bulk of their own funds. About 60% of funds for the public schools was raised at the local level, typically by school board, by real estate taxes that went to the local school board. The bulk of the rest was provided by state governments. By 1980, the state government had become the senior financial partner, and local school boards raised only around 40% of their own funds, again, roughly where they are today. So in that 20-year period, there was a substantial shift of financial responsibility away from the local school board toward the state. That, of course, is intimately involved with the, is intimately connected in one's mind with the Serrano decision in California. However, the move was really well underway before then. Now, one can debate at length the potential advantages and disadvantages of this centralization, and I'm not going to do that here. As Chris said, I like to lean on the facts, and the facts are that this financial centralization is not associated with improved school performance. Quite the contrary. Those states which moved earliest and most extensively to replace local financing with state financing tended to have, other things the same, sharper deterioration in school performance. These facts are consistent with a view that's recently been articulated by John Chubb and Terry Moe in their book, Politics, Markets, and American Schools. Their view is that school performance is inhibited by the layering of bureaucratic controls over them, which are remote from and less responsive to the parents. In some sense, my result is in that spirit, because financial responsibility moved further away from the local school boards to a more remote kind of bureaucracy, the State Department of Education. And it shows up. It shows up in school performance in the sense in which I've just alluded to. Let me come to a third important change in the political environment of education that came to a head just as school performance began to decline, and this is the push for desegregation. Again, we're going back now to a period that's receding into history, but the push for desegregation historically is coincident with the decline of school performance. You can date it to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and indeed at the time that these pressures arose, the potential effects on school performance was the subject of much lively debate. There was a fear that the disruption caused by the need to deal with this problem would compromise school performance. And again, I prefer, instead of going over old debates, to look at the facts rather than conjecture, and they're reasonably clear, I think. The pressures led to two distinct responses. Southern school systems desegregated massively. Northern systems remain as segregated today as they were in the 1960s. Neither response, however, is associated with a marked compromise of school performance, again, holding these other factors constant. In fact, the Southern systems, which desegregated most completely, tend to have done better than the average system in the country, both in terms of black student achievement and white student achievement, in terms of resisting the forces of declining performance. So I think one, on the basis of the facts, can sort of rule out the pressure for desegregation as an important contributing cause. Finally, I come to a more subtle change in the political environment of schools, one which I'm going to deal with at some length, because it has not received much, if any, attention to my knowledge, but which, at least in my research, I find to have had a very profound impact on school performance. And this has to do with the role of business. Today, business groups are at the forefront in pressing for education reform. And there's, for obviously, good reason why business has put this problem on the front burner of its concerns. Business bears a direct and substantial cost from this decline in the performance of public schools. They bear a cost in terms of decreased productivity that accompanies a less well-educated workforce, and they bear the cost, in many cases, of providing remedial education in-house. It's perhaps a sad commentary on the state of the schools that a lot of basic literacy and numeracy education goes on inside businesses today rather than inside the schools. At the same time, their demand for educated labor has grown over time, as the role of traditional blue-collar jobs has declined. It's of more than passing interest to note that this second part of the story, this massive push toward employing more educated workers, occurred precisely when public education performance was deteriorating. If you take the 2 decades from 1960 to 1980, the share of the experienced labor force with college degrees more than doubled, from under a tenth to over a fifth. College-educated labor accounted for over half of the job growth, the net growth in jobs in these 2 decades. This rate of growth in credentialization, if not education, of the labor force is unprecedented. Now, one would think that this massive increase in demand for educated labor would have mobilized business to resist the forces of deterioration in public education. After all, their demand for education is growing substantially, and you would think that as the forces of decline begin to assert themselves, they would be out front and putting pressure on the political process to reverse it. Now, obviously, either it didn't, the business community didn't do that, or it didn't succeed in doing it. And I think there's good reason. There's good reason why business pressure failed to stem the slide of public education. Let me develop my argument in stages. First, business interests have to be translated into political pressure. In the case of education, that means pressure at the state and local level. Secondly, not all business interests are going to be equally important at this level, or indeed at any level. For example, a politician in the state of Wisconsin, I think is safe to say, is going to be a little bit more receptive to the interests of the dairy industry than to the interests of college professors, let's say. And one can note the solicitousness, for example, of politicians from the state of Michigan to the interests of the auto industry, or politicians from the state of New Jersey to the interests of the drug industry. That's just an example of what I'm talking about. Industries don't carry the same clout in particular areas. Now, when it comes to an issue as broad as public education, those industries which do have some local political clout already have weak incentives to get heavily involved. To see why, let me take as an example, and I want to stress only as an example, something like Silicon Valley in California. Now, if that industry used its local political clout to improve California's schools, most of the benefits are going to accrue to other employers in the state of California. Perhaps it's therefore better to spend the limited political capital that this industry has on something of more direct benefit to the industry. Say, convincing its local politicians who come to Washington to lobby for protection against foreign competition or something like that. The point is, one starts here with influential industries having a fairly weak incentive to push for broad improvement in the public schools. Now consider how much weaker these incentives become when Silicon Valley begins hiring mainly college graduates and PhDs. At least back a generation ago, when Silicon Valley or its appropriate predecessor, which I suppose would have been the defense industry back then, when that industry was bending metal with a largely blue-collar labor force, at least back then, most of these workers, or at least a lot of them, were products of the local school system. A failure of that school system could not be easily overcome by recruiting replacements from afar. The relative immobility of these less educated workers at least gave some incentive for an industry like defense or electronics, which is important in the state of California, gave some incentive for that industry to exert pressure for better local schools. But when you're talking about college graduates and even beyond, you're talking about workers who are vastly more mobile than the less educated labor that merely graduates from high school. In the case of something like Silicon Valley, proportionately fewer of their employees today are the products of the California public schools than the blue-collar workers of a generation ago. Indeed, we know that in that particular case, many of them are the products of the local public school system in India and in Korea and in Taiwan. The point of all of this is that the direct interests of an industry in local schools weakens as it shifts its employment base to a more mobile set of college-educated workers. I wouldn't have gone through this long argument if the evidence wasn't consistent with it, but it is. I found that in those states where the locally prominent industries shifted most extensively to college-educated labor in the period that I'm talking about, the 2 decades from 1960 to 1980, the performance of the state school system deteriorated noticeably more than the national average. Now, I cannot link this fact to any direct evidence of weakened political pressure for better schools. However, I think it does raise a red flag about the plausible role of the business interest in public education. The politics of public education remains a state and local politics in a world where employees, and indeed their employers, are increasingly mobile without long-term ties to one locality. Making the business interest in public education effective is going to be more difficult than it used to be. This brings me to the prospects for the future, with which I'm going to conclude this talk. Is American public education likely to turn decisively around and substantially improve, as it has not done for the last 30 years? One can easily read a pessimistic answer into what I've said today about some of the forces which I have argued produced that earlier decline in performance. The rise of teacher unions, the decline of local financial responsibility, the weakening of a direct, immediate business interest in the way local schools perform, all, for one reason or another, seem largely irreversible. Nevertheless, there is a larger message that can give grounds for optimism. And that larger message is that the performance of public schools is susceptible to pressures for change that emanate from its political environment. That is, the public schools are not irremediably unresponsive institutions beyond all hope of salvation. The big question, of course, in the context of my talk today is, where will the pressure for favorable change come from? The gist of my argument is that over the broad sweep of a generation, most of the pressure for change has been pressure for deterioration. Where's the pressure for a reversal of that going to come from? Now, one possible answer is the business community, provided it can overcome the obstacles to collective action which I've discussed. That's a big if. The plausible business interest in the quality of the public schools cuts across geographic and industry boundaries. It is therefore going to require a broad-based coalition of business interests with very powerful arms in each state. And I simply don't know if a change of that kind can be brought off. A more immediate source of pressure on public schools is likely to come from the burgeoning demand for what's called choice today, the buzzword of the political debate about the public schools. And of course, this term has many meanings, and I'm not here to talk specifics. However, the kind of choice that will, I think, leads to an effective response, and perhaps the only kind, is one in which the customers can deny resources to the public schools. If that does become a widespread possibility, and I have absolutely no idea whether it will, but if it does, I am convinced that public school performance will turn decisively up. I don't want to rule out the possibility that that might happen without some kind of system which allows the ultimate customers to deny resources to the public schools. But in terms of the levers of public policy, some countervailing competitive pressure on the public schools, I think, probably offers the most immediate method for reversing the dismal history of the past generation. And I think I will conclude here. That leaves you 20 minutes. Thank you. Now, I am told that if there are questions, I have to recognize the questioner, and somebody with a microphone will come and stick it in your face. But I don't see the microphone, so I'll... Go ahead. Oh, here is this gentleman has the floor.
Thank you. Some friends of mine in California attribute immigration, both legal and illegal, to the decline of schools there. Did you look into that, and is there any support for that hypothesis?
Again, you might find it in one particular case, but I want to stress what is difficult about the problem. What I'm talking about is not limited to immigrant communities in California. In fact, to some degree, it is more important in places like Iowa and Nebraska, where you don't have an immigrant within 100 miles of any consequence. The phenomenon is very broad, very powerful, and still little understood. And I don't want to rule out that immigration in one particular need to cope with it in one particular case may have had some contribution. But shutting the gates to immigrants is not going to change the performance of public schools. That is not what caused them to decline, I can assure you. Okay, right and back. And then go to Bob over here, okay?
Okay, I'm David Bose with the Cato Institute. I noticed you said 1965 to 1980, and I think that's pretty much right if you're looking at SAT scores. And I just wonder, do you have any thoughts about why it sort of stopped deteriorating in 1980? It doesn't seem to have gotten any better if you use those scores, but it hasn't gotten much worse.
Right. By the way, it's not just SAT score. Almost any broad measure of performance would have begun deteriorating within a couple of years of that date. Well, in part, it's my contribution to this question. Again, I don't want to say it's the only reason. The contribution that I can offer is every one of the forces I've talked about petered out around 1980. It's really rather interesting. The unions had reached their peak by 1980. The teacher unions had reached their peak. The big shift toward devolving, toward moving financial responsibility away from the local level was essentially, it's still going on, but in a much weaker form. Even this paradoxical result about the business interest, that as they begin employing a more educated labor, their ability to influence local schools deteriorates. That stopped in 1980. I can't emphasize strongly enough how not only unprecedented in terms of the past this shift to educated labor was, but even in terms of the decade since 1980. It slowed down markedly. So all these forces, and even, desegregation, which I'm arguing really had no important role, in fact may have had in the South, may have had partially a good effect. Even that was over by 1980. Whatever happened by 1980. So the last decade or the last 13, 15 years have been, in these terms, a much calmer period in terms of the forces, the political forces operating on the schools. That's my contribution. Again, the change before was so massive, and the end of it was so abrupt that I would be fooling you if I said that I've just given you the whole story. But I think it is part of it. It's the part, at least, that I can talk sensibly about. Now, Bob is next.
Yeah, I understand.
Identify yourself.
I refuse. As I understand it, the teachers unions had a great deal of influence in getting federal regulation. I don't need this. Getting federal regulation of schools and financing and so forth. Have you looked at the federal influence?
Yeah, the federal influence is, in terms of financing, the regulatory influence is, to this day, rather weak. I mean, this is constitutionally a state responsibility, and other than the bully pulpit and denying a few federal funds, there's not much leverage. The peak of the federal role in financing occurs roughly around 1970 with the maturing of the Great Society programs. Basically, the local school boards were able to offload things like lunch expenses onto the federal government. And that peaked in the 70s, and it's come down since then. It peaked at under 10%. Federal government simply has never had a big role to play. And these days, it's down to 5% or less. Go right in back of gentleman right in back.
Thank you. Erwin Stelzer, AEI. I had two questions. One, is there any discernible effect from the massive shift in industrial structure with a decline of the Fortune 500, the AT&Ts that used to spend a lot of money, or said they did, on local education, and the rise of much smaller companies? I guess that's a shift of about 20 million jobs. And second, is the choice, I'm trying to figure out how you think choice will play out. Is that a way of localizing finance again, and of in most of the choice schools there are no teachers unions. So
Right.
is that a way of simply reversing the trends that you saw happening, that you discussed earlier in your talk? How will choice
Let me
play
deal
out?
with the second question, because it's the only one that I can really respond to extensively. My meaning in bringing up choice has to do with the point that I think schools are responsive to pressure that emanates from the political environment. It could be part of the political environment is who's paying you. It's not that you're going to get rid of it's not getting rid of the unions per se or anything of that sort. I think that my research has convinced me that the public schools respond to pressure. And had I not found that, I would be considerably more skeptical about the prospects for choice, short of a complete takeover of the education process by the private sector. But I don't find that, and I think it's that aspect which I would emphasize. The schools may remain dominantly public. They may remain dominantly unionized. But if the potential is there to deny them funds, if they don't shape up, I think they will move. I do not think that the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association will ultimately want to repeat the same mistakes that the United Automobile Workers and the United Steel Workers made when faced with exactly the same sort of competitive pressure. That's really the basis of that remark, rather than any direct influence. The way I see it playing out is that if those pressures for choice do succeed politically, and I mean choice in the way that I've defined it, you will end up with a public system, maybe a little smaller than the one we have today, but not much. Maybe a little less unionized than the one we have today, but not much. But you'll find different union policies and different educational policies.
But then if you do the regressions again before what happened,
Yes.
will you still get the same explanatory power from an initial?
I have not even thought about how I'm going to structure the study that's going to talk about the political factors that are responsible for the rise of American public education. Erwin, I will tell you that one in about 15 years when such a study will be appropriate. Now, you did have another question. I've now... Okay, let's leave it. Come right up to right. I'm going to work the back of the room now.
Ben Wattenberg from AEI. I have a few short questions. One is, my understanding is, and I wonder if it's correct, is hasn't the decline in SATs also occurred in private schools? And what does that say about choice, and how competitive is it really if the competitors aren't any damn good either?
Right.
Go ahead.
Let me say, first of all, I don't know that that's a fact, but it almost has to be, given anything that anybody knows about the period that I'm talking about. No one escaped. No one escaped. And I want to stress, again, I want to stress, I am not here today to give you a coherent, complete explanation for that decline. There are other factors that I've said nothing about and that I know nothing about that must have played a role. That's the only way I can answer that question. Really the only way I can answer that question.
Okay.
I do not want this lecture to be taken as a complete explanation for what went wrong with American schools.
I have two other brief questions. One is, if you look at this from the point of view not of the scores, but of the students, and you end up with a university system which is populated by those students, which I gather scholars all over the world still say is by far the superior university system in the world. How does that happen? And you want my other
no,
one?
as somebody who teaches at a university which has pretensions to being an elite university, and as someone who's been in the business for a long time, I can tell you that even we see the impact of the deterioration of American public education. There's absolutely no doubt that when I began teaching, the average student to whom I was teaching was more literate, more numerate, or whatever the right word is. You see, I've even slipped back than the counterpart today. I think where American higher education excels is in a couple of areas. First of all, we're very open to the rest of the world. I'm talking about the level that I know about. We're very open to the rest of the world. And indeed, some of our best students now come from public education systems or private education systems from outside the United States. That's been a great source of energy for American higher education. In the case of my institution, which I should mention is the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago, a quarter of our students are now from outside the United States, and that's a source of great energy for us. And the other dimension, of course, is in research, where the reasons are one can debate, but the output is not simply bringing students in the door and giving them a BA 4 years later, but it's doing research, and at that level we maintain our lead. Again, partly because we are, I think, partly because we're so open to the rest of the world that you have this phenomenon that they all congregate. The best people in the world congregate in one place. There's a compelling economic reason for that. That place happens to be the United States. No one has ever gotten a lead on us in academic research. If we had to depend entirely on the products of our public school system to maintain that, I would be very pessimistic about the future. Now, go back, right in the back there, there's somebody.
My name is Max Green. I had a couple of questions. One regarding the possible effect of unionization on quality of education provided. I haven't been involved in New York City during the time period that you were talking about. Matter of fact, during some of it working for the teachers union.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was happening there was like a breakdown of a social structure that had absolutely nothing to do with the teachers union. And I happen to remember, as a matter of fact, in 1967, there was a strike over the whether or not teachers would have the authority to assign disruptive students to schools for emotionally and socially maladjusted children. And the teachers union was denounced for that, and actually eventually these schools were gotten rid of, and as a result there's far more disruptions in schools in New York City now than there were 20 years ago. But it happened at the same time the union was becoming strong, but as a matter of fact, is really what happened is an example of how even a strong union can sometimes be weak. But it probably had more to do with the decline of education in New York City than the rise of the UFT. That's the first point I would make. And I suspect that was true in other areas as well. I mean, that if you saw this decline first in the areas where the unions were first strong, that's in like these liberal, metropolitan areas where there was a breakdown in the social structure that occurred long before it hit suburban areas, the South, et cetera. Right. Two is that you may be off in saying that the unionization was completed by 1980. You had all these teachers organized by then, but the National Education Association was only gradually transformed into a union. Right. And although it's just like the AAUP, the fact that somebody belonged to the AAUP 20 years ago might mean something very different than the fact that he belongs to it now. And that transformation of the National Education Association actually continues to this day into a collective bargaining union. So I don't think you can say it got started late, and that's an organization that's 3 times as large as the American Federation of Teachers, right, and still not completed. The final point I wanted to make was this is regarding kids that go through public school systems get hired by the private sector. So they only go to a high school, not on to college. I just happened to read the other day about Honda, which is set up in Marysville, Ohio. They're hiring kids out of the public school system with a high school degree. They're not requiring anything more than that. They give them a basic literacy and numeracy test. If they do all right in that, they hire them, and they're great workers. So there's no real reason for Honda to put any pressure on Marysville, Ohio, or anybody else to improve the public education system. They're getting good products. And I wonder the same thing is true of all kinds of factories that are setting up, at least in the South. So I wonder what you have to say about that. In the past, at least, those were considered to be the most backwards educational systems.
I think we have time for me to comment on only one of your talks. So pick it. Which would you like me to comment on? The first one. Chris says the first one. All right, he's the boss. The first two. Again, I want to be clear about what I've said. In many ways, the first point was very much like Ben Wattenberg's point, or my answer would be very much the same. There are undoubtedly other things that are driving the change in school performance. And without getting into the nuances of my data, my research, I am simply saying that on average, and even in places not so affected by what you call the liberal politics of particular urban areas, even in areas not so affected, where teacher unions tended to succeed earlier, performance tended systematically to deteriorate more than average. This is a broad national kind of tendency rather than one which I would wish to characterize as applying to any particular locality. Now, the second question requires one to go into a little bit of the history of unions, which you're familiar with, but the rest of the audience may not be. The allusion to the maturing of the National Education Association has to do with the history of the development of teacher unions from this period in the early 1960s. The pioneer here was the American Federation of Teachers. At the time, the National Education Association was like the, what did you say, the AAUP? It was kind of an organization like that, a professional organization wholly dedicated to preventing unionization. The NEA was an anti-collective bargaining kind of outfit in 1960. When the American Federation of Teachers organized New York, it saw some handwriting on the wall and said, by God, if we don't compete, we're going to lose some members. And it was then, in the early to mid-1960s, that the National Education Association began actively seeking to represent its members as collective bargaining agents. When I said that the process was largely complete by 1980, I mean precisely this. Of the total membership of the National Education Association in 1980, over 80% were represented in collective bargaining agreements by the National Education Association. Only 20% of its membership by that date was the residue of its days as a professional association. That is, people who were members but weren't being represented collectively. And the penetration of that union, the subsequent penetration of that union subsequent to 1980 has been trivial. The remaining targets of opportunity are in states which have proved durably resistant to unionization. So of course it does bear some legacy of its days as an anti-union professional association, but by 1980 that was vestigial. Go right to the back. This lady in the back, please. I think you've had your hand up.
I want to say first that I speak as a person who attended the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business and was personally responsible for some of the decline in standards recently. I got to highlight...
Gee, I don't remember you.
But I remember you. I have to come back a little bit to the point that was made by Ben Wattenberg and the other gentleman here about public versus private schools, because I think some of us in the audience are just aching to say there is a cultural problem. There is a big cultural problem that's taken place over the past generation that has to do with simply less importance placed on standards of higher education. And I mean what I said about I was working a hell of a lot less hard than my parents were. And in terms of your research, it does sort of beg the question in the sense of, all right, all of the schools are declining. I mean, if the private schools have declined too, just education generally has declined. You make the point that, yeah, but some public schools have declined less than others.
Yeah.
That seems to be the contribution of your research on the political dynamics. I thought your talk was very interesting, and I have no doubt of what you're saying, but it does kind of beg the question of what is the significance of that difference vis-a-vis the cultural issue that seems to be a problem. So if you could address that briefly. The other thing I wanted to ask you is just to help those of us in the audience that would like to develop our own armchair theories about this and really aren't that familiar with the statistics. Could you give us a little bit of the lay of what did you find in terms of what public school systems were doing well, what areas of the country versus the ones that have not?
Yeah. We're probably running over time here, but you want me to do the second one first? The lay of the geographic variety here is actually quite astounding. There is no broad, if you wanted sort of a very broad brush view of which school systems tended to do better, I could mention the South. Well, every time I say this, though, the exceptions are almost begging to be called out, and I don't really want to go through, like a convention where we go through the role of the state, good, bad, and I don't have time for that. It wouldn't be very helpful. I don't get into that. Broadly speaking, the areas that tended to do better than average are in the South. The ones that tended to do worse than the average, the worst, would be very surprising. If you take the belt of states running between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, it's not the Northeast, it's not the industrialized Midwest, it's those states which have done the areas dominantly free of problems of segregation, desegregation. Those areas tended to deteriorate most rapidly. As a broad brush. Now, the Northeast and the Northeast and the West Coast did not do terribly well, but if you want the extremes, those areas would characterize the extremes. You had another question that I have to address. What's the contribution of my research? Well, I think it's just this. If you wanted to take one thing away from this, it's that while it isn't the whole story, there is a measurable, it's palpable, I think, in the way, at least in my data, there's a responsiveness of the public schools to political pressure. As I said, if I didn't find that, I think you really would be in the place where you would like, where your comment suggests we ought to be. There's been this huge change for some reason. I don't know what it is. I don't work as hard as my parents did. Throw up your hands. The public schools can't be helped. In fact, maybe nothing can help American education. I think that's wrong. I think that is just dead wrong. I think that, and again, I don't want to, since we're looking out into the future, I can't really put any attach quantitative significance to it. But I think if the political pressures got reversed, we're now been in a period of 10 years where it hasn't gotten worse. If the political pressures got reversed, I think we have at least a fair chance of kicking it up. That's really the main message that I would like to leave you with today, if there is one. Where are you wandering? Why don't you work this side of the room? I'll give you some exercise.
Moving off of the statistics for a minute, you had commented that in your personal perception, the quality of student has declined. Could you identify some of the qualifications or representations of a declining student? Could you talk about what a declining student looks like?
You want an anecdote? You mean just
yes,
my
I do.
anecdotal?
I'd like to have sort of a representation of what their skills are that they don't have now that they used to have then.
I would list them in the following order. Literacy, basic literacy. The ability to spell, the ability to write a declarative sentence.
Okay.
Mathematical skills, second. And third, a historical sense, utterly vanished from public school, from students of this generation.
So their inability to relate to the past?
Yes.
To make relationships?
Yeah. Those are the three that I would, much more important than memorizing jargon and economics.
Uh-huh.
let me tell
Anything
you.
that they're doing particularly better?
Excuse me?
Anything that they're doing particularly better or differently than we did?
They're personally more mature. I don't think there's any question about that. They're much better on their feet than they used to be.
Interesting.
That is,
you.
social skills are better.
Are you describing undergraduates? Or are you going to
I have taught undergraduates as recently as 2 years ago, so in some sense I'm talking about them too. In fact, I really should confine my comments to them. The students that we get now in business schools tend to have been out a decade from the public school experience, and you see traces. You see traces in those students. A lot of these defects never get remediated.
The reason that I ask the question is that I wonder about the effects of the hierarchy's perception of appropriate behavior versus what is really perhaps development of more higher order skills. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, there are a whole bunch of people in America, and most of our jobs are being created by highly entrepreneurial people who are sort of out there and not flowing through business schools and into large corporations. And in fact, maybe we're doing better in some areas than we think we are, and maybe some of these memorization skills aren't quite so important. I realize that this is heretical, what I'm saying.
What we're doing is certainly different. I'll grant you that. There must, I mean, I don't know what they're doing at the lower school level to create the somewhat more polished characters that we're seeing. Somewhat more. I mean, we're really talking about 5% differences. But I'm sure some of it comes at the cost of these basic skills.
I wonder, I realize that there are some things that don't lend themselves to regression analyses and the sort of thing that economists can usefully do. But I wonder, I don't say that in any derogatory
No,
sense.
I
say
take
that,
it.
no.
You people laugh. I take it as a great compliment. Go on.
But I wonder to what extent what we've seen is a product of the fact that to an important degree, the educational system is no longer virtually a monopoly employer for women, that you have this migration of educated women into other occupations which were not open to them in the same degree 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, let me
And
just
you have a concomitant deterioration of the teaching force.
I
The
think
second question is the obvious one about television, which I know you
Right.
probably can't address.
I can address that. I mean, that's been studied by others, and I can. I'll take the second one first. It is an example of the difficulty of coming to grips with this phenomenon. If television was, this is, as I said, one of the problems is the precipitate nature of this decline. I mean, it really begins, dated, January 1st, 1965, it begins. Kids had been watching television for 15 years by then. And if that had an important contributing role, you should have seen it measurably. Excuse me, I'm an economist. I always lapse it. You should have seen evidence of it well before 1965. So that's the problem. You can argue that it strikes one's intuition as plausible, not consistent with the broad facts. Now again, the narrower facts, I don't know. The question about teachers, the increasing work opportunities for women. First of all, again, that's a very powerful trend that vastly predates 1965. The big push for opening up the workforce to women begins 20 years before. Number one. Number two, the one thing we do know is that wages of teachers, salaries have kept up with wages for women generally, if not exceeded. The relative pay of teachers has either remained level with other women or even increased. What that means is that the ability of the schools, the material ability of the school systems to compete in this labor force did not deteriorate, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. This was a time when relative pay for teachers was going up, not going down. I think I began this talk by pointing out this striking contrast between the explosion of resources available to public school systems, both in terms of the number of teachers and in terms of the dollars that were being spent, and the performance of the school system. So it was there's nothing hampering the ability of the public schools to compete in this labor market. It's what kind of talent they chose to buy that I think is what we have to question. Where is the? You want to hike across the room? Whatever, right over here.
I'm just curious if
You should identify. I said Chris
Amanda
wants-
McIntosh. I'm curious to know if you have any solutions to the problems, or you can go over what solutions you said. I understand that Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management has been going into the Chicago schools and helping manage those schools. I'm wondering if there is a problem with the management and if it's mismanagement that has led to the decline.
The short answer is no. I don't buy those kind of explanations. Management problems don't occur in a political vacuum. And you know, my short answer would be, under the right political circumstances, that management is going to change, as the teachers will change and as union policies will change. And I don't think, short of that you're going to get much change. And, you know, this is not a management problem. I think the education establishment would like you to believe that it is, because that will attract funds to fund programs like this. But I don't think that at bottom it is a problem. Of course, in some sense, it's a management problem, but you have to ask what the roots of the problem are, not what the surface manifestations of it are.
Let's continue this discussion. I know there are some more questions in the reception afterwards. Sam, thank you very much.
We are looking at that one, and I think we are going to be in the Navy. I just got to get my head in. Yeah, right. We will be back to you.